To all of the news in a moment, but first, here's my take. You might have missed it, but a meeting this past Tuesday near Pakistan's capital city of Islamabad could possibly mark the beginning of the end of America's longest war, the conflict in Afghanistan, which will enter its 15th year this fall. A delegation from the Afghan government met with members of the Taliban, with Pakistani, Chinese, and U.S. officials present as observers. Previous efforts like this one have foundered, and this one may go nowhere as well. But the war in Afghanistan is likely going to end in a forum like this one and not on the battlefield. Talking to the Taliban is tough for many Americans to accept. Dick Cheney was speaking for many when he said, "We don't negotiate with evil, we defeat it." And yet, says Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's former chief of staff, he's dead wrong. In a new book, Terrorists at the Table, Why Negotiating is the Only Way to Peace, Powell argues forcefully that historical conflicts like the one in Afghanistan have ended only through negotiations and not military victory. Powell is no peacenik, having been an architect of Britain's support for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But over the course of his decade in office, as one of Blair's most important aides, Powell came to recognize that terrorism cannot be solved exclusively or largely by military means. He quotes Hugh Orde, the former chief constable in Northern Ireland, who says that there is no example that I know of terrorism being policed out or eliminated through the use of force. Now, governments are loath to talk to terrorists. That's understandable, since they regard the groups as barbaric, worry about legitimizing brutality, and remain convinced that military force can defeat or at least cripple them. But Powell points out most governments end up talking to terrorists anyway, citing examples ranging from the Mau Mau in Kenya to the Basques in Spain to the Colombian FARC. The central idea behind Powell's argument is simple enough. Terrorism is a reflection of an underlying political problem that almost always needs to be addressed politically. In Afghanistan, for example, it reflects the reality that some part of the Pashtun population, which is about 50% of the country, believes that its interests are not represented by the current government in Kabul. Now, this week's negotiations might go nowhere, but one of the lessons that Powell notes in the book is that often these talks begin too late because governments believe that one last military push will put the terrorists on the defensive, even though, he says, there is precious little empirical evidence to support this one last heave argument. He reminds us that a crucial part of General David Petraeus' surge in Iraq was reaching out to Sunni militants, terrorists, who had been fighting American forces, addressing their grievances, and indeed paying them to move from being foes to friends. He notes that Petraeus admitted that the United States waited too long before it talked to people who had, quote, American blood on their hands. Of course, none of this would apply to ISIS, would it? In fact, Jonathan Powell is bold enough to suggest that it could. After all, ISIS is a particularly brutal and murderous group, but it is successful largely because it has tapped into the fears and rage of disempowered Sunnis in Iraq and Syria. That is a political grievance that can only be addressed politically. Talking to terrorists is not giving in to their demands, argues Powell. But because governments are so spooked by the image and the optics of it all, they usually delay, fumble, make mistakes, and prolong conflicts that could be resolved earlier and with much less bloodshed on all sides. For more, go to cnn.com/Fareed and read my Washington Post column this week.